All right. Welcome everyone to this next installment of the Responsible Innovation series through the Digital Data and Design Institute at Harvard. We're so excited to have you all here. For those who weren't with us for our previous session, this is a new series that we're kicking off at D-Cubed to talk about how we can innovate responsibly in a rapidly changing world with this rapid innovation and capacity for emerging technology at an all-time high. We're trying to figure out how we can ensure novel solutions are creating positive societal impacts, as well as reducing potential harm to all stakeholders who might be affected by those. So this series is going to explore how to innovate responsibly, inclusively, and equitably across a wide array of domains and skills. And we'll see that today in our panel with these lovely guests who are going to share with us their experiences in the product inclusion space. So let's have a quick intro to our guests who've so kindly lent us their time and expertise. First, we have Mallory Carroll, who leads product inclusion and equity research for the wearables team at Google. Her research leans more strategic and is specifically focused on gender equity. And outside of work, she created and runs a 90-person Slack group of product inclusion and equity practitioners from across the tech industry. It's a wonderful Slack group, and is a contributor to Equity Army and Inclusive by Design. Next, we have Tafari McKenzie, who's a senior product manager who leads the product equity team at Uber. The product equity team works to foster a culture of building inclusive experiences by enabling teams at Uber to prioritize the perspectives of historically and systemically excluded communities. Welcome, Tafari. And we also have Ellie Kemery, who is a principal research expert at SAP Design. She is leading a practice time area called Research Ethics. Ellie's focus includes product inclusion, responsible AI, and sustainability with an emphasis on product impact. Her work helps teams to ethically build intelligent, human-centered product experiences. So, as you can see, we have this really wonderful range of perspectives that are going to contribute to this conversation. We're so excited to have these wonderful panelists here. Thank you all for joining us. I'm so thrilled to have your time and expertise as part of this conversation. As a quick reminder to the folks in the Zoom, we'll go just quickly over what the agenda for today is going to be in the Zoom norms. We're going to start off with some prepared questions for the panelists and get their perspectives on sort of an overview of the product inclusion space, maybe what barriers there are currently, what their day-to-day looks like in trying to implement some of these initiatives. And then we're going to turn it over. We want this to be a really interactive session, as I've mentioned. So toward the end there, we're going to leave plenty of time for audience Q&A, and would love to see any input from the audience, any thoughts you might have that are spurred by the conversation that we have in the first half. We ask up until that point that you remain muted, and even during that time, please remain muted unless you're called upon, but you are very welcome to raise your Zoom hands. Those are down in the reactions button in the Zoom window. If you raise your Zoom hand, we'll call on you and you can ask your question out loud if you're comfortable doing so. If not, feel free to drop it right in the chat, and I'll be moderating those and relaying them to our lovely panelists along the way, and making sure that we address any of the questions that are burning in the chat as well. All right, with all of that said, I think now is a really lovely time to kick off and start asking our panelists some questions that we have for them. So first of all, welcome panelists. Thank you again so much for joining us. Just a really powerhouse group, and I'm so excited to hear your thoughts. Thought it would be great to kick off with sort of a general question, since many in the audience might not be as familiar with product inclusion. I would love if each of you could describe sort of what that process entails and how you tend to go about building equity and inclusion into your product life cycles. Mallory, if you want to kick off with that one.
Sure. Hey, everyone. So excited to be here. So before I dive into like the process of how I practice product inclusion and equity, I want to just call out like the definition of this space it's pretty like nuanced and complex, and many different companies and even like practitioners actually like define the work in a variety of ways and differently. Like it's called inclusive design, product equity. At Google, the team doing this work is called product inclusion and equity. So there's a lot of like different names, and I think this just highlights like the nascency of the space and how it's really emerging within the tech industry, and how it looks different at every company. And so I just wanted to call that out before like diving into the process. But I see product inclusion and equity as the practice of centering the most marginalized voices throughout the entire end-to-end product development process, and to really like co-create more equitable products and experiences together. And so in a more concrete way, like what this could look like is when I'm first approaching like either a new product idea or even like area, or reviewing a current product feature, I would start working with my team by asking like, who has been historically excluded from the space that we're working in. And so to do this, you can do a variety of things. You can do, and I'm a researcher, so I would start by doing like a literature review, looking at barriers in society, as many times these are replicated within tech. Also doing like conducting foundational research, looking at current, if it's a current product, like satisfaction across different people and groups and communities. You can also just look at the makeup of your user base of the product or the feature and see who's not using your product and who's left out. And so making experiences equitable really just requires an understanding and prioritization of needs of various people and communities. So I think that's kind of the first step of understanding like where the tech has either failed or just provided lesser value and where there are gaps. I think the second step is determining which people and communities to focus in on and like which to bring into the design process. And our team does that by identifying which communities and people are the most impacted or have the biggest barriers to actually like seeing the full value of the product. And this really just helps illuminate like the biggest opportunities to improve the product. And so from there, we'll then create a strategy for how to engage those people and community groups. And this takes a lot of time. It takes relationship building, it takes building trust, creating safe spaces to engage and do research. And we'll bring in representatives from those communities, and we'll really work together as co-designers throughout the end-to-end design process. So this could be creating new concepts and solutions, doing co-design in terms of like design flows, product strategy, and really bringing them in as like co-decision makers throughout the end-to-end process. And so that's a very like high level and like simplified view, but that's kind of the end-to-end process for me. And this is a pretty big mindset change for teams. I also just want to call out, because it's really just, it's bringing in people from outside of our small tech teams to be co-designers and like co-decision makers in the process. And I'll leave it there because I would love to hear Tafari and Ellie's view.
Yeah, I can chime in. So I'm also a researcher, as you heard. So I tend to start there, but I think involving people in the process end to end as co-creators is the way that we approach things too. But in the research process as well, like thinking of people that you're including as co-researchers even, and letting them actually guide you versus coming up with a preconceived notion of what you're hoping to learn, sometimes is a way that we try and uncover things we wouldn't know to even address, right? Or experiences that they have that we wouldn't otherwise see. So so we approach our product development process in a similar fashion. But the other thing that I would layer in is that it's really important that the team, you're approaching your work in an inclusive way, because oftentimes teams are very siloed away from one another, and they don't often even participate in the research, let alone get to engage with people from marginalized communities as they're going through the product development process. And oftentimes that's where compromises are made and decisions are made that lead to outcomes that are exclusionary. And so really being intentional, not only about who you involve in the research and prioritizing them and approaching your research in a much more participatory and actually the whole process in a co-creation type way, but also making sure that everybody's involved, right? End to end. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot has been said so far, so I don't want to reiterate everything. And we do something really similar at Uber as well. What I'll add is it's when it comes to not just doing the work and figuring out what that process looks like, because the space is so new, it's really important to prove the value of the work, and that becomes a huge part of just the project, the feature itself from a product team. And so I think one thing that's been really important in co-creating everything from, you know, start to finish and making sure that you're validating along the way. One thing that's really important to prove is that what you're making isn't just valuable to the group that you've focused on trying to lift up, it's valuable to everybody. And that's been something that's really important to focus on in terms of making sure that this work continues, and that this approach is a really good way to make products and features, because it doesn't just help the group that we are intentionally trying to focus on that has continuously been left out of product design. These features help everybody and just makes better products along the way.
Okay, that's a great overview. Thank you all for lending your perspectives to that. And now that we have this better understanding of sort of the high level vision and process of what your teams are achieving in your respective organizations, I'd love to dig in a little bit and give folks some concrete examples. If there's maybe a product or feature that has been improved by utilizing inclusive design and development practices, or if there are any products or features that could be from any organization, any government, any NGO that you think could benefit from maybe incorporating some of these practices as well. And maybe we'll start off with Ellie this time.
Yeah, I mean, something that I'm a big fan of, because I know the team responsible for it, is the Microsoft Adaptive Controller. I think it's a great example of a process where they really involved people of diverse perspectives, and specifically the people who are often most underrepresented in the creation process. And it was a highly collaborative effort, and, you know, with product managers, developers, like end-to-end QA, research, all of it working actively together through many, many, many iterations. I mean, several years of work, but also as outcome of that effort, and because of the impact that it made to the business, they've now gotten the funding to do an inclusive tech lab, which is going to change the way that they build products, you know, within Xbox and probably throughout the company. So it's just illustrating that this is a path forward for a lot of groups.
I'll share a feature from Uber that's live so I can talk about it. If you were familiar with Uber when it first started, you needed a credit card or a debit card to use Uber. And if we're thinking about the US, it's something like 25% of Americans are unbanked. They don't have a credit card or a debit card. And that isn't really good for business, but it's also really not good for a quarter of Americans that now just don't have access to something like Uber and getting a safe ride if they're trying to get somewhere. And so Uber had to incorporate inclusive design practices and think about, well, how do we solve this problem? And what they did was they partnered with CVS, and CVS is pretty omnipresent in the US. And now you can go into any CVS and exchange physical cash for Uber Cash by just handing your cash to the cashier and scanning a QR code. So you can load up your account with Uber Cash, and now you can ride Uber, you can order Uber Eats, you can order Postmates. And it's a solution that when Uber was originally designed, they weren't thinking about people who didn't have credit cards. They weren't thinking about people who only had cash to use. But it doesn't mean that we still can't create like an easy, frictionless experience for these people. And I think this is a really good example of what inclusive design can look like, because it's an example of meeting people where they are and thinking about, well, what are their exact needs and how do we solve for this use case without compromising the product in any way, and actually enhancing the product where now everyone can have Uber Cash. And there's so many other use cases for Uber Cash other than just if you don't have a credit card. And I think I always point to this as an example of thinking about where those gaps are and where your product was lacking, who can really benefit, why it's good for business, and why it's good for everyone for these features to be built this way and come to life. And I think it helps people think about what product design can be, and what inclusive design can be with something like other than just like accessibility work and making sure things are WCAG compliant.
Yeah, Tafari, I also just read about new safety features Uber came out with that was geared toward women and non-binary people. So I thought that was also very interesting. A lot of exciting things coming from Uber. But I'll give also example from my own company that's public so that I can talk about it. But I think a good example of a product really being improved based on inclusion is the camera on the new Pixel phone, which the team really focused on combating image bias in camera technology. So just as a little background, like historically, camera technology has excluded people of color. You know, it was common for photos people with darker skin tones to just be unflattering, you know, due to the camera not adjusting to darker backgrounds, and it would blend in with skin tones, erasing features. Also, when the brightening features to combat this then created an unnatural washing out and like lightening of actual skin tones. So there's a lot of issues there. And the camera team worked really closely with the product inclusion and equity team by tuning specific models and algorithms to more accurately highlight a variety of skin tones. And the team did this really with co-creation. They gathered, you know, better data by partnering with photographers from the community to actually accurately portray different skin tones. They worked with a variety of people from different backgrounds and ethnicities, and really like fine-tune those models. And this resulted in like actually innovative industry standard features now. And it resulted in the camera, now it recognizes like a broader set of faces, correctly represents skin tone like much better. It makes skin brightness appear more natural, not like washed out. Also sharpening of features in skin tone in low lighting, and just like even more. And so now this is really becoming like the quality and standard for camera technology. So this is just another example of how inclusion and centering people, the most marginalized people, or the people that your product really doesn't work well for, can just create a higher quality product for everybody. So I thought that was just a great example. And the way the team went about it was truly, they really honed in on co-creation with the community at every step of the development process.
That's a really great point from each of you, and really, really wonderful examples, especially of how just it truly does benefit everyone and make for better tech and better innovation in general if it's designed inclusively. And there are many other examples from throughout history, including like the typewriter and various audio communications devices that have been developed for exactly that reason, just to make things more accessible to everyone and usable. So I love hearing those examples of emerging innovations that are doing similar things. It's really wonderful. And helps put a lot of this into context. We're taking it from like process and theory into practice, and that's really wonderful, I think, for folks to hear. So now we're going to flip a little bit to maybe some of the challenges that are involved in that sort of process of making things inclusive. What do you all see as the greatest barriers to the adoption of product inclusion practices? And since our audience is very interdisciplinary, this can come from any realm. I think we're going to touch on a lot of barriers in the Responsible Innovation Theory series in general. We're going to be talking about funding and human capital and training, regulation, all types of different things. So would love to hear your thoughts from anywhere in that spectrum of what maybe some of those barriers are. Tafari, if you want to kick off this one.
In tech specifically, I think it's not usually like leadership that's the biggest challenge in trying to get support for this work. They're usually very supportive and understand that it's good for business, it's good for public image, it's good for stock price. Everything about inclusive design is good for business. It's really usually middle management, and like to Tom's question in the chat, that's really the issue that we have to combat as a product team and as like a organization. And I think it is a huge misconception that inclusive design takes a lot of time and costs more. I think that's the biggest challenge, is correcting that misconception. I think one way to think about it is all of these steps that we're talking about already happen in good design and good practice. You already have to conduct user research. You already have to test your product. You already have to go through iterative design phases. All of these things are already an inherent part of the process if you are making a product. And so it's not really a shift in taking more time and doing extra work to hit all of these checkboxes that we're talking about. It's just shifting who you are conducting this work with. And I think one thing to think about is tech has for so long been focused on building for like the rich white man in San Francisco. And that's fine. Like, you will get feedback from these people about like, hey, this button doesn't work when I click this, or, you know, it would be nicer if it did this, like XYZ. You get feedback from them. But if you were to interview someone who had a disability, like maybe they were blind, you're going to get feedback about how your feature does not address their needs, whether it's their disability, like whatever it is, you're going to get all of that feedback, plus all of the feedback you would have gotten from the rich white man in San Francisco. Like, someone who is blind will also tell you this button doesn't work, or like it would be better if we did all of this. You're not missing out on any feedback or anything by shifting to someone who has more feedback for you, and you're actually gaining time by just going to these people directly, because you're getting all the feedback you would have gotten plus more that you would have had to go back and retroactively fix in the long run. And so I think it's a huge misconception that this takes more time, because all of these steps are already incorporated into product design. And the like fallacy is that you're not including all the time you'd have to spend to go back and fix everything that you didn't do the first time by not incorporating these people from the start. And that's a hard misconception to just conquer without someone goes through it and learns the hard way and wastes a bunch of time fixing their product. And then they're like, oh shoot, that actually took a really long time to do that. And they think it took a long time because they had to go back and do it after they already did everything, and not realizing they could have just done it from the start and not had to do everything twice.
I love that you brought that up, because that's exactly what I was going to say about the fact that, you know, it actually saves time and money for the company by adapting the way that you work to be inclusive, because you catch those things up front. And also, you know, you unlock things that you would never even know to work on, or to, you know, problems that you would never know to address that are key to the outcomes that the company is trying to have. So I would say, everything that you said, Takari, that was a great walkthrough. And I do think that's one of the number one challenges in reality, is that perception. Because even for me, one of my key focus areas is on operationalizing inclusive research across the entire company. And at SAP Design, it's not only SAP Design. I sit in SAP Design, but it's SAP, right? Globally. And there's so much resistance and fear, like an uncertainty around how to do product inclusion, and it is this misconception that you know, it takes more time. It's a new thing they have to do and learn, which is not the case. You know, it's just simply being intentional and adapting what you currently do, and working, like I said, inclusively with your whole team versus just, you know, the handoff type of situation, that will really make things, you know, make those outcomes much, much better for everyone. I don't know if you have anything to add, Mallory.
You two really, you said it all. Also, that was like exactly what I was going to say as well. It's really more of like, it's a mindset change, like a process change. I think that just takes some time to get everyone on board to like thinking more critically, like thinking differently. Because this isn't like, inclusion isn't like the default, as we know, in tech. And I think even like some of these practices are actually like at odds with a lot of traditional product development practices. So an exclusion kind of like unintentionally will happen under this guise of like efficiency. And that kind of is what relates to like what Tafari was talking about. We're just building for the people that are within the company. We're building for this like unidentified average user, which ends up being like the white, higher income, like tech kind of bro. And then instead of just critically thinking about our entire user base as a complex, multidimensional group of people. And so we're building this like one version of tech and for the average, because it's more efficient. And then we're having everyone else adapt to that one version, or have to hack the version to actually have it work, under the guise that it's more efficient for our users, or it's our target user base. Instead of actually building technology that is flexible and adapts to the diversity of people that we're building this for. And so that's something that's kind of like at odds within the development process. Also, this kind of idea that we are these these designers, and we have this professional expertise because we have these like fancy degrees and the skill set of being a researcher, being a designer, or product manager. And we're like traditionally in tech, we're the ones building the digital world. Like we are building, deciding what to build and building it, versus product inclusion and equity practices are asking us to actually give up some of that power, like shift that power in decision making to people outside of tech, and specifically people from historically marginalized communities that have been left out of the design process, who we don't think about in terms of who our users are. They also face systemic barriers to get tech jobs, even be in the room, and be in leadership decision-making positions. And so it's kind of a mindset change too, to also say, you know, we're not the experts in all of these experiences and not the experts for building for every type of person and user. And so that again is another mindset change of, we shouldn't be making all of the decisions without bringing users in to actually co-create inclusive products. And so again, these are just like mindset and processy changes that I think a lot of people are on board with, but just figuring out how to get people and create incentive structures to actually start to practice this work and think more critically about it, I think is a barrier within the industry. But I also want to call out that again, like this space in tech is fairly new. So I do see it shifting in a positive direction. It's just these things like organizational change and mindset change does take time.
Absolutely. Those are really great points that, you know, there are a lot of perspectives that need to shift before the actions that then follow will shift as well. And this is true. I know we have panelists from really large organizations as well, but I also want to call out that this is true of any organization. This is true of your social enterprise, your NGO. You are constantly having to prove that there is value in making these inclusive design efforts and that it really is beneficial for the company and the product in both the short and long term, that you're, you know, not necessarily moving as fast and breaking things. You can still move fast without necessarily breaking things and then having to fix later as far as, and, you know, a lot of that due diligence comes in this process and making sure that you're co-creating effectively. There's a lot of value in that, and convincing more people to agree with that sense and then moving from there, I think is a really good place to start. So we have one more question in our list before we kick over to the audience Q&A. I'm seeing some really wonderful questions in the chat. We are going to get to those. Please keep dropping them in there. We'd love to see them. I'm just going to ask one more of our panelists around sort of what we've been discussing in terms of working with the audiences that we seek to serve. We know that iteration is a continuous and critical factor in innovation. We want to keep coming back to the ideas and the assumptions that we're making and testing them and reevaluating and iterating again. So how can those working in tech or tech adjacent fields incorporate new information into their product creation and to ensure that inclusion is prioritized both during that initial launch phase and post-implementation? Anyone who'd like to start with that one, who's got one top of mind, feel free to jump in.
I can start. So I think, I mean, this is my researcher perspective. And I think Ellie mentioned this previously, but I think really just getting more proximate to people from end users from marginalized communities and bringing them into the development process at every single touch point. Because like Ellie said, like many teams are siloed from some of this research or from these insights. And just really like having teams start seeing past like numbers or personas or these kind of like averages, like segments, and actually engaging with real people that use our products and really seeing these gaps and what inclusion can bring and these types of insights too that Tafari was talking about, that are just going to add and make better product experiences. And I think that I think there's a question in the chat about this, but to do that, you really need to build more like relationships, avenues to get more proximity to users and people. I even like go back and forth of like whether to use the word users because it feels so like just, yeah, I've been trying not to use the word user recently and just use people because it's people. And I think this can be done too through like more equity focused research touch points. So we talked about like co-design and bringing people in to actually design like new concepts, talk about what needs are are the biggest priority, where are the biggest gaps in your current designs, and also bringing people in to actually make decisions. So like recently I was doing a co-design project where we actually worked with people within a specific community, and we brought in like the technical restraints that we had. We brought in our prioritization framework, and we actually worked with them to decide like what should be our move forward, like what design should we move forward with, knowing like these are our short-term technical restraints, and like here's what we want to work toward for the long term, but like could you help us make the decision of which one would be more inclusive and equitable for right now, knowing we're trying to build to this like better future. And so I think even just being more transparent within the research process too can really help kind of uplift some of this decision making, because I think sometimes we just don't consider inclusion and equity in decision making or prioritization frameworks. So it's just being more transparent about the decisions that we're making, I think is a good starting place.
To build on what Mallory said, and I'm a researcher too, so that's how I'm thinking from that perspective, but that not only the transparency is critical. Oftentimes what I'm trying to get researchers to do, and I practice myself, is actually treating these folks, like these people, as not participants, but as co-researchers. So we talked about co-design, but also enlisting their help, right? To take us through what their experience is like through their eyes, and things we wouldn't even know to put into our research plan, right? So those kinds of things can be incredibly valuable, and the continuous and iterative nature of that involvement is really key to the question in the chat about people feeling like they wouldn't be listened to. You know, it is a mindset shift in terms of like going from this end user, which is like far away from us, and or even participant, like I talk about doing research with, not on people. So that is a really different way to approach it. And there's something else that I think is really important for the whole team to kind of embrace, which is again a mindset shift, culture change, is and I would remove the word validation from everyone's vocabulary if I could, but like getting people in a frame of problem seeking where they're actually looking for things versus like confirming what they want to see, right? Just as another layer on all the amazing, you know, things that Mallory just mentioned that are so true.
I think those are really great points. Tafari, did you want to add to that?
No, like I think that covers it. Yeah, it's hard one because you have to think about like what kind of new information are you incorporating, but I think that I really like those answers.
Yeah, likewise. I think especially that emphasis. Oh yeah.
I was just going to say, the other thing that I find really critical, because I am so focused on product impact, just so we can fund this work, is accountability. So, and that has to come from leadership, where they're putting in place leading and lagging indicators. The leading indicators can be about inclusion. The lagging indicators can be, you know, things like user experience related, but I feel like without that accountability and an intentional focus on leading indicators, so you can see like how the work is happening, so that the outcomes happen in the way that is inclusive, and the way that we create better outcomes for everyone, I think is key and not happening a lot of the time.
Yeah, totally. And just to add to that, like adding in inclusion and equity success metrics, because typically our success metrics are just so there's overall success or overall numbers, and we're not actually looking critically at the data across like a variety of different people and groups. So I think even just creating specific inclusion, equity, success metrics and keeping track of those too really helps with the keeping accountable.
Absolutely. And I like that we touched on sort of different stakeholders within sort of that system mapping, and really understanding the entire ecosystem of who all is being impacted by this tech, and the differentiation from users, I think, was really interesting too, because it's not always users who are being impacted by the things that we create, right? There are also sort of external factors that come into play that tend to impact other folks in regulatory environments, or, you know, folks who aren't users, but who are sort of tangentially interacting with the tools that we create. So I think it's really important to have that holistic understanding and emphasize that we're prioritizing that early on. All right, now is a great time to kick over. We have some really lovely questions in the chat. Again, for folks who may not have been here right at the beginning, we like this to be as interactive as possible. I know some folks want to kind of kick back and just listen in or watch the recordings after. That's totally fine as well. Any way you're interacting with this material, we love to see it. But if you do want to raise your hand and ask a question out loud with our panelists, that's also totally fine as well. Irina, you actually had one in the chat, so I would love for you to expound upon that a little bit.
Sure. So I'm not quite in exactly the same field as you. I'm a learning designer, and our product is ultimately digital because it's an online learning program and course. And even though we're not developing the platform, it has similar elements of digital development and production. And I'm really interested in this because we are struggling with a revision process for courses, and there's a lot of issues around ownership, and that keeps coming up. And I'm actually working with a faculty member on a mod in the business school program about innovation and like learning about integrative thinking. And I'm like, well, why don't we try that? Instead of arguing about like, well, operations owns this and the school owns that. But there's definitely, I now feel like I have words around this, like, rather than being like, oh, she's so controlling, I can say, she believes that, there's trade, like she thinks that if they're bringing in an opposing view and it contradicts us, then one of them is right, one of them is wrong. Right. And she's trying to avoid having that tension. So I've been on this thing of like, how would we train our teams to think differently about bringing contradictory
embracing diverse perspectives?
Yeah, that. Well, but not in a kind of like, oh, but in a process way. Because when you say embracing diverse perspectives, I think people just like they don't see that as relating to like work.
Yeah, does anyone have thoughts on sort of translating? Because definitely you want really varied input, right? And sometimes that can feel tense and challenging, but that's productive tension, right? Like it creates a new way of thinking about the same problem, or maybe introduces a new problem in a productive way that makes you realize you need to address it. Do folks have thoughts on translating that?
Yeah, like I think it's helpful to frame it as a conversation around innovation. That's usually really helpful. I think a lot of the features that people love are features that weren't designed for who they probably thought it was designed for, like things like subtitles or like that's not designed for me to like watch a YouTube video while I'm in a meeting. That's not what subtitles are designed for. But I don't think they probably wouldn't have designed that feature if they asked someone in all of these like typical research meetings to come up with something like that. Like it comes from looking at diverse perspectives and thinking about, well, how can we discover something new that is so valuable that we wouldn't have come up with it on our own, because all of us in the room all have the same like experience and we all have the same ideas about what works and what doesn't. It's more helpful to say like, oh, we're not just looking for diverse perspectives because we want to do the right thing and like be inclusive. Like it's not about like this altruistic sense. I think it is, but that's not usually what lands well with people. It's more about like finding new opportunities and how to be innovative and set your business apart. And you're not going to do that by continuously just asking the same group of people to come up with new ideas. You need to ask new people and see like what their life experience impacts in terms of what they're looking for and what they need, and see where that new opportunity is.
I love that you said sets you apart. I mean, one of our new leader, differentiation is what she keeps saying. And so that's if I can come at it that way. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Mallory, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I love that point. And I also try to do the same thing where we're centering around like innovation and how this is just like a better way of developing products for product quality. I also think it really is like a learning journey. Like you kind of have to build like a curriculum that almost like builds on top of each other to really start changing the mindset, because like a few trainings a year isn't going to change the way it may start to get people thinking, but it's not going to change the way people actually act, is what I've found. So I've been collaborating a lot with our DEI team, who's experts in that space of training and kind of mindset organizational change. I've been really thinking like strategically about who's going to help me, who's like actually put these changes into action. So getting a really strong executive sponsor, finding my kind of like co-conspirators at the product ownership level and at the middle management level who actually have like processy decision-making power. So I've been working really closely with our PMs who own specific like product requirement documents so that we can embed inclusion and equity thinking into already like workflows that people are already used to. And so like taking those small steps and then having like a training that's actionable around that thinking and that actual workflow. And then continuously kind of like building it into the product development process while layering on these like mindset trainings with the DEI team. And then also having our executive sponsor be reiterating this at the top level as well in our bigger organizational meetings. So it's coming from like multiple different directions. And it's not just somebody kind of speaking to it, we're also like acting on it, and we're continuously engaging with some of these trainings. So I've been trying like a few different approaches, just seeing where there has been barriers in the past. So that's kind of the approach that I've been taking internally.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Very strategic.
It really does take a multifaceted approach. I mean, these things are, you're talking about cultural shifts. You're talking about hopefully lasting cultural shifts. So this is like a total evolution. You're talking about, you know, in some cases, reworking things completely from the ground up. And that all takes a myriad of approaches, the training, the executive, like bottom up, top down, centering people. I love the approach of centering people on innovation and also outcomes, right? So staying focused on that, you know, to kind of get across those things, those barriers that come up. But I think Tafari and Mallory just like nailed it.
And that's actually a really wonderful segue into another question that we had in the chat. Just kind of talking about training and access and empowering all segments of society. That was a question from Jorge about how we can empower folks to have more access to training, hardware, software options. And it also kind of ties into Tom's question about empowering people, especially from underrepresented groups, to give more feedback into these processes. That's kind of multifaceted and different perspectives to come at it from. But I guess in those various realms, what are maybe some steps that folks can take to make sure that that training and access and feedback is approachable to a wide array of folks?
Mm-hmm. I mean, so I'm actually doing quite a bit of that across SAP right now, not only on the product inclusion and equity side of things, but also on responsible AI. And you really have to, there's a couple of things that Mallory said that I would go along with, which is like starting with a launch partner and starting to pilot, you know, the training and proving out the value of this change, but also all the while creating the materials, meeting people where, like understanding where people are so that you can meet them where they are internally, understand what their mental models are for approaching this work and what's preventing them from doing it. I think one thing that I discovered early on that was kind of a surprise to me, honestly, was the fact that researchers, who I think of as inherently like equitable and, you know, inclusive people, like we care about the people that use our products and we want to surface their needs to the teams. But there's a huge fear, like an emotional resistance to just fear of being wrong or saying the wrong thing. So you have to understand those things in order to get people to a place where they can actually practice. So I think it's training, but it's also hands-on experience, right? Like you have to kind of build the muscles in a way while doing the work.
Yeah, and those are all amazing points. I'll just add like a few things that I'm doing, just to layer onto that. But I think having a shared language and being clear of how to talk about this work, and also how it's all evolving as well, really is helpful for, at least I've seen it be helpful for my team to all kind of be on the same page. Like we're having conversations right now about how to talk about gender equity within the company, because it is a complex topic and there's so many different people with various identities and multi-dimensional identities, and what terminology should we be using. And so we're constantly having those conversations and trying to create a safe space to talk about that, and asking questions, and creating also like anonymous ways to ask questions. So all of those questions that people might not feel comfortable asking, we still can get that within our teams. We're also having like these smaller community conversations about some of these topics that I'm doing. And I even previously it was kind of not like a project, but I ended up just interviewing when I first started people within my team, and doing like just interviews. And it started out with like one-on-one conversations, then it turned into just like, I'm just going to talk to everyone on my team as a researcher, but also just as a team member. And ask them, what, like Ellie was saying, like, what are their barriers to doing this work, and why are they excited about it, or why do they feel like they don't have time? And just kind of talking about, what are the biggest barriers within my team and within different organizations, because it could be different with product designers, researchers. And then also like documenting my own learnings throughout the journey to just showcase that even I'm still figuring out certain things, and sharing that within my team at team meetings, I think has been really helpful in making the work more approachable, that like we don't all have it figured out and we're learning along the way. And I think that's been great too, of like, I've been connecting with a lot of people across the tech industry, and just all of us kind of sharing our learnings to try to like move forward the space, and understanding that this still is very new. So I think that's been helpful to make it more approachable within my team.
I love those very research and continuous learning oriented approaches. They're very much aligned with D-Cubed as well, and a lot of why we're here today. So that's a really great thing to call out, that it's a lot about talking to people and just continuing to learn what everyone's experience are, what their challenges are, sort of collating that information. Jorge, I saw that you raised your hand. Did you want to add into this question?
Yes, thank you for taking my addressing my question, and I apologize for the remote. I'm remote working today. I don't have all my gadgets and the lighting and all that stuff, so I'm off camera. But I just wanted to add, and thank you for sharing all you're doing in trying to address the innovation as it reaches the end user. In this case, you have addressed very well. And Tafari, I love your example on Uber trying to reach out to the cash-only segment of society. That was really amazing. And that's really thinking outside the box, because what you're doing there is that you are providing your service to that segment of society that is really needed there. So, they can benefit from the use of Uber in the whole society, instead of just the credit card society. So that's one way of addressing or giving access to all segments of society. And that was the brunt of my question there, because I wanted to find out what else you're doing to really service the end user. And I know that you have addressed that through your processes in research and other things that you're doing to try to address that. But I think it needs to be taken to that final step of execution in thinking about the end user. Not only leaving it at the research and trying to bring everybody's ideas together, but also taking it to the last step, which is serving that end user, customer, people. Thank you very much.
And thanks, Jorge. Very much agreed. I think that when we talk about sort of product life cycles and how we can incorporate inclusion into that whole process, have a really systems thinking approach, and understanding all the myriad ways that the things we create are interacting with society. And also, I know some of our audience are not the people creating those things, or the people trying to, implement policies around those things, and really considering just all the different ways that even post-implementation, it's being interacted with is a crucial factor in this as well, and making sure it stays equitable. Did you want to add to that, Ellen?
Well, I mean, right now I'm doing this work around, I told you, responsible AI, and equitability is a huge part of that work, because we need to make sure that, the data, not only the data sources that we're using to train the models, but that, continuously those things are assessed, right? So post launch of an AI application, in other words, we have to continuously monitor how it's performing and have protocols in place to ensure that things don't go in a direction that is exclusionary or harmful in any way to anyone or society. And so, yeah, absolutely. It doesn't stop with a launch. It carries forward. And I would only add too that there's techniques out there that teams can use to start to forecast these things, right? Like, what are the unintended consequences of this work, right? Or the application that we're developing, or, there's actually a list of questions that I'd love to publish. I'm also going to be publishing some other materials in June that will be externally available to everyone. But these questions are critical to be asking all throughout the product development process. Like Mallory was talking about, like, who is typically not considered, like, who haven't we prioritized, right? But especially in this time where everybody's all gung-ho on these new technologies, right? Where things can go in a very bad direction very quickly. It's critical that the team collectively stop and think about these things as they're going through and post, like I mentioned, yeah.
Great. And we touched a little bit on success metrics that was in the chat as well, which is great. I'm glad we got into that a little bit. I see we are down on time, so maybe we won't dig into that too much more in this moment, but it's fodder for definitely future conversations as we go through this series. I like to end personally on a really optimistic and forward-thinking note, because there are so many exciting things happening in this space. As you mentioned, there's a lot being published. There are working groups who are thinking through all the best practices and all of these, different elements of trying to ensure that our innovations are equitable. Also give just the call outs and calls to action. Now, folks who have joined us, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll have more RI series things coming along in the future. Please fill out surveys and let us know how you liked this one. We'll adapt in the future, in the spirit of continuous learning and making sure we're being inclusive and incorporating everyone's views. So to close it out on this really lovely, optimistic note, looking to the future, I would love for our panelists to give us a quick overview of maybe some positive trends that they see in the product inclusion space that give you optimistic outlooks on the future of innovation. Whoever wants to jump in on that, please feel free.
I think it's huge that these teams are becoming more normal at companies, like big tech companies. Having a product equity team is new, but I think that's a really positive trend. And I think it just shows the importance that companies are placing on this work, to the point where they are formally structuring an approach to it and treating it like any other like issue that they need to tackle as a company. But I think what's more promising to me is just the continued public criticism that companies get. Like, I think people are just continuously feeling more and more comfortable calling companies out, tweeting about them, posting about them on Instagram. Like, all of that public conversation, I think, is really what pushes company change. Like, embarrassing a company is really helpful for making a change. And I think that has been a trend since social media has taken off. And I really just think it's a really strong push to keep this work going. And I hope people don't stop doing that, because it really is a huge point of leverage for our teams to push this work forward.
Yeah, just to add to that, like, I love those points. Like, people are really like demanding inclusion and equity. So I think that's really exciting, especially the next generation. So that is awesome. I've also been seeing a lot, I think I mentioned this, but a lot of like cross-company collaboration and just like sharing of knowledge and learnings to really like move this space forward. So that's been really exciting. There's been like a lot of summits and just like coming together of people from across the tech industry to just talk about like how do we leverage each other's learnings to really just continue to make progress. I've also been a part of a lot of great discussions about making community co-design more of like the standard throughout product development. So I think that's been super exciting because it's really like a core part of this work. And I think lastly, something that's been really inspiring to me and I think is necessary in this movement is this movement around like trauma-informed research practices and also like decolonizing research and the product development process generally. And also this idea of like design justice thinking. And it really examines more of like the relationships of power and technology and social systems and like where those intersect. And so I think that has been really exciting to me. And I hope that's kind of where the industry is going toward.
I can only agree with everything that both Tafari and Mallory said. I mean, the other thing for me is that externally, I mean, systematically, at least there's governments and countries coming together to put into place, you know, policies that will hold these companies accountable, you know, to certain things, right? Like, I'm thinking about the World Economic Forum and some of the work they're doing around AI to ensure that AI is not harmful. Also, the Bill of Rights that even the US is putting together, I think is a positive trend because, you know, in a for-profit world with, you know, capitalism, the way that it is set up today, I mean, in order for, there has to be, it will take this, it will take requirements, you know, laws, it will take people, just like Tafari was mentioning, like sharing and shaming, honestly, companies. In my space, it's, you know, B2B. So we do enterprise software. And I will say that one of the biggest forcing functions for investment in this work has been customer escalations, because customers now deeply care about their employee experience, right? It's competitive to have the best talent. And if you're not making experiences at work inclusive, and that's been great. You know, I like fully embrace that. I'm so excited whenever I get that call from an executive that's like, hey, we need to talk about this escalation. Like, yeah, okay, let's do that. So all of those kinds of things are really positive.
There's such phenomenal notes to end on. I love that so very much. To synthesize to everyone here and everyone who views the recording after, it seems like whether you are actively involved in creating these new innovations or not, you have a voice, right? That's the thing we want you to take away from this series in general and this panel in particular, is that you have a voice in how these innovations are brought to society and how they interact with society once they're there. So that's really what we want you to take away from this experience, and love to hear more from you on this topic as we continue with the RI series. Thank everyone for coming, our audience, and especially our panelists who have been so wonderful in lending us their time and expertise. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us. All right, have a good day, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.